All right, everyone. So we're going to try and finish up the Schelling essay today. We left off with the discussion of the relation between the ground and God, and the way the understanding, which is God, uh, comes into a kind of unity with the ground, with nature, and that the higher the degree of this unity, uh, the um, well, depending on the degree of this unity, there is freedom to some extent. Uh, the absolute unity of God and the ground of God is God as spirit. Spirit is the term Schelling uses for the kind of being in which ground and God are unified. Now, the Spirit of God has the ground and the understanding in a complete unity. God understands the ground fully. For the human being, there is also spirit because there is a recognition and consciousness of both ground and of God. But unlike in God, in the human being, that understanding is incomplete, and that incompleteness allows a disunity between the two. It allows the ground and God to act independently as independent wills within the human being. And uh, this, Schelling says on page 33, is the possibility of good and evil. Uh, now, this So let's read on here. The reality of evil is the object of a whole other investigation. He's only talking about the possibility of evil. The principle raised up from the ground of nature, whereby man is separated from God, is the selfhood in him, which, however, through its unity with the ideal principle, becomes spirit. So human beings have spirit, have personality, have selfhood, right? Selfhood as such is spirit, or man is spirit as a selfish, particular being, separated from God. Precisely this connection constitutes personality. Personality, the fact that there is personality in humans, is the sign of spirit and the duality in man, the dual wills of ground, anarchy and darkness, and God, understanding and light. Now, uh, as we have mentioned, right, it is the presence of the will of the ground in man, which uh, which is independent, uh, that human beings have the capacity to be evil. And we see that the spirit is, in particular for human beings, a selfish spirit. Right? So, this is going to be one of the causes of evil. Uh, so, he says on the bottom of 33. Um, uh, There thus emerges in the will of man a separation of selfhood, having become animated by spirit, since spirit is above the light, from the light. There thus emerges in the will of man a separation of selfhood. Selfhood becomes independent, separated from the light. That is, a dissolution of principles which are indissoluble in God. So those principles of understanding of goodness, the perfections of God, are not found in man. Man as individual spirit, as having knowledge of this self ground, which is independent and acting autonomously from God, uh, in man with this incomplete understanding, there is uh, a dissolution of the true and highest principles of nature. And that dissolution is again the possibility of evil. If, to the contrary, the self will of man remains his central will in the ground, so the divine relation of the principles persists, and if, instead of the spirit of dissension that wants to separate the particular from the general principle, the spirit of love prevails in it, then the will is in divine form and order. Okay, so uh, in other words, right, where the human being is able to be guided by love, the love of God, where love motivates the human being uh, is acting freely, uh, independently, but in the um, in the name of God, in the name of order, in the name of light and understanding and love, right? Love is the motive toward understanding. Uh, so, again, not so different from Plotinus in some sense, right? If we focus on love, what Plotinus would call purifaction, but purifaction is precisely the sort of term that Schelling would want to avoid, right? Uh, But nevertheless, right, we have this capacity to, as he says in another place, allow the will of God to act through us, uh, allow ourselves to be propelled by love. That is one option. However, right, so that would be the possibility of good, of doing good, of being a good person, of being ethical. Um, he says, but that precisely this elevation of self will is evil is clarified by the following. Right? So, this elevation of the self will, the spirit in the human being, which is able to apprehend and act according to the will of the ground or the will of God, uh, that is this self will, which is evil. And he'll say this in many places that evil, in essence, is the attempt to, by man, to usurp the place of God. In essence, to attempt to assert the human spirit as the proper orderer and organizer of nature rather than God. Right? To play God is the essence of evil. Wherever we believe that we are able to take control of nature or gain a complete understanding of nature, or that we ourselves are the pinnacle of nature, that is the self will believing that the ground is a ground not for God, but for humanity, right? For human beings to take themselves as gods. The will that steps out from its being beyond nature in order as general will to make itself at once particular and creaturely strives to reverse the relation of principles, to elevate the ground over the cause, to use the spirit that it obtained only for the sake of the centrum outside the centrum and against creatures. Uh, so, uh, from this results the collapse within the will itself and outside itself, right? Wherever the human being elevates the ground over the cause. And this is to say that wherever humans say nature, darkness, anarchy come first, as we discussed in the last video, and it is the human being who is called upon to bring them into order. That is an elevating of the ground over the cause, which is God. The human will is to be regarded as a bond of living forces. Now, as long as it remains in unity with the universal will, these same forces exist in divine measure and balance. But no sooner than self-will itself moves from the centrum as its place, so does the bond of forces as well. In its stead rules a mere particular will that can no longer bring the forces to unity among themselves as the original will could, and thus must strive to put together or form its own peculiar life from the forces that have moved apart. Right? This is the particular will, the human will, attempting to do God's work, right? Attempting to make human spirit the centrum rather than the divine spirit the centrum. And right, it cannot, this human will, bring the forces together. And we remember the first act is the separation of forces, but as we'll see, the ultimate teleology of that is the unification of forces. Remember to find that which is central, the centrum that is common to those bodies and forces that are separated at the highest level, most separated. Right? Um, so, uh, this being, so I think perhaps that's clear. Sorry, we're jumping ahead a little bit here. But we're going to follow up on this. We're now on page 40 here. The fact that the particular human will is capable of evil is not, as some would have it, for example, Descartes or Plotinus, does not come from the fact that the human is finite. Finitude is not itself the cause of evil, right? For Plotinus, it would be the finitude, the particularity, the limitedness of our physical being, which is the manifestation of evil. Right? Schelling writes on page 40, evil does not follow from the principle of finitude for itself, but rather from the selfish or dark principle having been brought into intimacy with the centrum. Right? The fact that it's not that the human is finite, it's that the human, having consciousness of this dark will, this ground, in addition to God, is able to make himself, the human, the centrum, right? To again usurp the proper centrum of God with the human centrum, to be, as we would say today, anthropocentric, to regard the human being as the center of all beings. And this is interesting, right? Just as there is an enthusiasm for the good, there is a spiritedness of evil. Right? Remember, for Schelling, evil is not mere absence or lack or deprivation. Evil, too, has personality. Evil, too, has spiritedness. Evil comes from a spirit and is spiritual. But it belongs to the spirit of the human, not to the spirit of God. Uh, Indeed, this dark principle is active in animals as well as in all other natural beings, yet it is still not born into the light in them as it is in man. Right? There are things in nature that we might regard as evil. Right? Um, uh, watch a nature documentary. The lion killing the giraffe, the mother eating its baby, right? And we may regard that as evil, but it's not properly evil because because it doesn't come from spirit, right? It is again that blind will. It is the nature of the ground itself. It's the nature of nature. Uh, and it only becomes evil when a being is conscious not just of um, the ground of nature, but also of God and the understanding. Right? Uh, it is not in animals and other natural beings. It is not spirit and understanding, but blind craving and desire. In short, no fall, no separation of principles is possible here, where there is still no absolute or personal unity. This is an interesting thought, right? That an animal doesn't have personal unity. I think this is a view that in the 21st century we would be skeptical about. It was a very common view in Schelling's time, especially throughout um, the 18th century. But the idea that there is a different degree of personal unity to the human being than there is to the animal is an interesting thought, and it is precisely the fact of personal unity that allows the human being to regard himself as central, right? And it is that unity, the unity, certain degree of unity of ground and understanding in man that makes animals are never able to emerge from unity, right? Whereas man can voluntarily tear apart the eternal bond of forces and is able to say uh, what should be. For an animal deals with what is and reacts to what is. The human being, having access to the understanding, is able to look at nature and say, not that, but this other thing. Right? And that is this right ability to tear apart the eternal bond of forces. Uh, so he goes on 41. If God as spirit is the inseverable unity of both principles, and this same unity is only real in the spirit of man, then in the principles, if the principles were just as indissoluble in him as in God, man would not be distinguishable from God at all. He would disappear in God, and there would be no revelation and no motility of love. Okay, so this is the beginning of a big idea, right? The human being must be distinguished from God. This is Schelling's entire point. Um, that in order to have freedom, we must be distinguishable from God in a way that, for as he says, all modern philosophers, essentially the human is not. Uh, why must we be separable from God? Why must we stand out? Must our existence be independent of God's existence in some way? Because if we were not independent in this way, there would be no revelation, no motility of love. There would be nothing for God's love to act upon, right? For every essence can only reveal itself in its opposite, love only in hate, unity in conflict. And so, um, in order for God to express himself as love, there must be this possibility of evil and even the reality of evil in the human being in order for love to become recognizable and to be active, right? To have motility, to be able to move, to act, to cause things, put things in motion. Uh, so that is why there must be a general ground of solicitation, of temptation to evil, even if it were only to make both principles come to life in man, that is, to make him aware of the principles. Man must have the capacity for evil in order to be able to recognize love. And this is, uh, again, different from the idea that God grants free will to man and then man misuses it and does evil with it. No, right? God sees the evil, although he does not himself will evil, he sees that there must be the possibility and even reality of evil in order, again, for love to demonstrate its superior power, for it to overcome. uh, this general ground of solicitation, of temptation to evil, is the possibility of God demonstrating his capacity to overpower the ground of nature. Um, it appears that the solicitation to evil itself can only come from an evil fundamental being. And the assumption that there is such a being seems nonetheless unavoidable. And so there is a fundamental evil being, but this evil being is only expressed through the human being as his awareness, his incomplete understanding of the will of the ground. So he elucidates this on 42 a little bit more. God himself requires a ground so that he can exist, but only a ground that is not outside but inside him and has in itself a nature which, although belonging to him, is yet also different from him. The will of love and the will of the ground are two different wills of which each exists for itself. But the will of love cannot withstand the will of the ground, nor abolish it, because it would then have to oppose itself. Right? Were God to make evil impossible, he would also necessarily make love and goodness impossible. In case it isn't clear yet, this is again, we mentioned the obvious connection to Hesiod, but what Schelling is doing here is returning to this most fundamental problem in pre Socratic Greek philosophy of the nature of opposites. How are they unified? Why are there opposites? And what is the nature of the unity of those opposites? For the ground must be active so that love may exist, and it must be active independently of love so that love may really exist. Right? Uh, Thus, the will of the ground admittedly also cannot break love, nor does it demand this, although it often seems to. Right? The ground is only a will to revelation, but precisely in order for the latter to exist, it must call forth particularity and opposition. The will of love and that of the ground become one, therefore, exactly because they are separate and each acts for itself from the beginning on. Again, a duality that is, in essence, actually a unity that the human being is not fully capable of understanding. So, on page 44, we get, I think, the fullest articulation of this. And I know I'm just reading from the book, and that's not the greatest way to go through this. But page 44 to 47 is really where Schelling gets into this in more detail. 4. As in the initial creation, which is nothing other than the birth of light, the dark principle had to be as ground so that the light could be raised out of it. So there must be another ground of the birth of spirit, and hence a second principle of darkness that must be just as much higher than the first as spirit is higher than the light. Okay, so right, spirit is higher than the light because it has consciousness of both light and darkness. And this evil of spirit then must also have a higher principle than the mere principle of the darkness and the ground. This principle, he goes on, the very spirit of evil, this principle is the very spirit of evil that has been awoken in creation by arousal of the dark ground of nature, that is, the turning against each other of light and darkness, to which the spirit of love opposes now a higher ideal, just as the light had done previously in regard to an anarchic movement of initial nature. Okay, so uh, it's in essence a series of the ante being upped, right? Uh, Light conquers darkness. Spirit becomes aware of the opposition between light and darkness. It then becomes capable of acting according to both light and dark. And this uh, act based in such an understanding is the arousal of a higher kind of evil. Uh, and it is this higher kind of evil that ultimately brings out the highest form of God, which is going to be uh, the, the ultimate meaning of God's love. Uh, just as selfhood and evil made the light or the word its own, right, and for that reason appears precisely as a higher ground of darkness, so must the words spoken in the world in opposition to evil assume humanity or selfhood and become personal itself. Now, this is, I assume, an allusion to Jesus, right, and the becoming uh, an individuated human of God. Uh, But I think Schelling has something else in mind here. What else is the story of Jesus about? It's about God entering into um, the world, right? The realm of appearances, the flux of nature, um, and this is uh, the possibility of God uh, entering into this realm of God becoming a force of history, not just of nature, but of human history as well. The birth of spirit is the realm of history, as the birth of light is the realm of nature. Right? So, history is where this higher principle of love is going, Schelling thinks, to overcome the will to evil that is inherent in the spirit of human being. Uh, as the undivided power of the initial ground comes to be recognized only in man as the inner aspect of an individual, so in history as well, evil at first remains latent in the ground. In an era of innocence and unconsciousness about sin precedes the era of guilt and sin. So, what Schelling is doing is uh, now weaving in human history to this story, right? An era of innocence and unconsciousness. And he refers on page 45 to the idea of the golden age of which only a frail memory and legend remains for modern mankind, a time of blessed indecision in which there was neither good nor evil. There then followed the time of presiding gods and heroes, or the omnipotence of nature, in which the ground showed what for itself it had the capacity to do. At that time, understanding and wisdom came to men only from the depths. The power of oracles flowing forth from the earth led and shaped their lives. All divine forces of the ground dominated the earth and sat as powerful princes on secure thrones. Right, so uh, this is a stage in the development of spirit. Now, we didn't read any Hegel, which is unfortunate, but Schelling is certainly thinking along Hegelian terms. The idea that spirit develops historically. History is the history of spiritual development. And this development is teleologically pointed toward the the understanding growing, right? The understanding grows. And as the understanding grows, uh, at first, what grows along with it is the capacity for evil, guilt, and sin, right? Uh, this appearance, this appeared to be the time of the greatest exaltation of nature and the visible beauty of the gods, and in all the brilliance of art and profound science, until the principle acted in the ground finally emerged as a world conquering principle to subordinate everything to itself and establish a stable and enduring world empire. So, where the human being uh, in the early stages of history regarded uh, God in nature, right? This sort of innocent belief, like God is the sun, uh, the ocean is a god, etc. When that innocence is broken, when we gain higher understanding of the nature of God and of the abyss, a greater evil emerges. And this evil is the evil, and I think this is fascinating, is the evil of a world conquering principle. Right? This is the evil, again, of the human being believing itself to be the centrum, the center of being, uh, to usurp the place of God. And this is um, certainly, I think we should connect this to uh, imperialism, colonialism, the expansion of empire. That is, you know, sort of essence of politics during Schelling's time. Um, so, what is this human personality, and how does the will uh, have the freedom to act? In an interesting sort of prefiguring of existentialism, Schelling writes, right, uh, that the I, the self, is real self-positing. It is a primal and fundamental willing which makes itself into something and is the ground of all ways of being. Right? But this decision cannot occur within time. Right? It occurs outside of all time, and hence, together with the first creation, man, even if born in time, is indeed created in the beginning of the creation. The act whereby his life is determined in time does not itself belong to time, but rather to eternity. It also does not temporally precede life, but goes through time unhampered by it, as an act which is eternal by nature. Through this act, the life of man reaches to the beginning of creation. Hence, through it, man is outside the created, being free and eternal beginning itself. Right? Uh, because the human does have this degree of understanding, uh, it is in touch with this original moment of creation. It has the capacity to lie outside uh, the mere causal order of nature, as well as the divine understanding. It is a ground in itself. The human being is a ground in itself. And being a ground in itself means being outside of time, being able to uh, to act truly autonomously. And a truly autonomous act is an eternal act, one that is not caused by something prior to it, nor which is determined necessarily by the consequences of what will come from that act. Uh, Freedom is the freedom to self determine. And that act of self determination is an eternal act, right? Eternal because entirely independent, right? Not a part of the flow of time, part of the chain of causes. Through this act, the life of man reaches the beginning of creation. Uh, right? And this gets us into some difficult territory, uh, which is how then does the human being, uh, ever know how to act? What is it that spurs this decision? It can't be anything in time or space, in the realm of appearances. It has to be completely sui generis, right? It has to be completely self-caused. Uh, and so the question is, do I really, excuse me, choose uh, what I am and what I will do? Uh, and Schelling thinks um, that in one sense, the answer is no, that I am what I am. I am that I am, in the same way that God is what God is. I don't get to choose my nature. My nature chooses itself. Um, that is the sort of paradox of human freedom. Uh, Freedom doesn't mean getting to decide who you are as a free being. Freedom means being able to act freely as the being that you are. Uh, and so he will say there are some people who are incapable uh, of being differently than the way they are. And on page 51, he writes that Judas became a betrayer of Christ. Neither he nor any other creature could change. And nevertheless, he betrayed Christ, not under compulsion, but willingly and with complete freedom. And so Judas could not have chosen differently. No one could have prevented Judas from doing what he did. And yet he still, at the same time, did it willingly and freely. He couldn't have changed his mind. It was a free act flowing from his own spirit, from his own nature. Right? And he gives another example, which is the example of Cato, who was one of Socrates' disciples. Cato is an example of someone who is incapable of doing evil, right? Who, if given the opportunity to do evil, would be unable to do it because it would not be the sort of choice that his nature would make. So we don't have the freedom to be anything we like. We have the freedom to be that which we are. We have the freedom um, to be the way we are, right? Now, this is extremely complicated material, and we'll skip over this a little bit now, but um, I want to mention one more point on page 54. Uh, the uh, how we act, our autonomy, is our own, right? Um, and this raises the question of, on page 54, that we may become good, that we can change that nature, that despite uh, right our acts flowing from our nature, that nevertheless we do have some capacity to change. Uh, Suppose now that human or divine assistance, right, man always requires some assistance, may destine an individual to convert to the good. Uh, then that he grants the good spirit this influence and does not positively shut himself off from it, lies likewise already in the initial action whereby he is this individual and no other. Those who are able to become good, uh, just as those who fall into evil, um, are not uh, making choices about what they are. Rather, that conversion is part of their essential spirit already, right? Uh, People are not good or evil. Um, our spirit vacillates, right? Our spirit is one that goes dialectically between ground and God, darkness and light. And so when we move closer to the darkness, closer to the light, that is a part of the human spirit. Um, that is our freedom. Our freedom lies in our ability to move in either direction. Um, and we do so as independent, autonomous beings, being what we are. Uh, right? So, that he grants the good spirit this influence and does not positively shut himself off from it, lies likewise already in the initial action whereby he is this individual and no other. This is why, in the man in which this transformation has not taken place, but in which the good principle is also not completely extinguished, the inner voice of his own better nature, in terms of what he now is, never ceases to exhort him to such a transformation, just as he first finds peace within his own inner realm. And so uh, we are what we are, but we are what we are, and that includes having these two wills acting within us, right? And when we are drawn to the darkness, we hear this inner voice of our better nature. We hear the other will. And when we act well, when we are ethical and good, we nevertheless feel temptation and are drawn to the darkness. So that is the experience of freedom, right? Why we experience ourselves as free. It's not that we're actually making choices, it's that consciousness of both possibilities. Our nature impels us toward one or the other, uh, but it is also in our nature to at all times always be conscious of both possibilities. And that is the human condition. That's the sort of curse of freedom, that you are one way, but you're aware of the fact that you could theoretically be another way. Uh, and those who go through a transformation according to their own nature, uh, right, will be part of the historical unfolding of God, right, as God acts in man as an instrument. And so he says, finish this off here. Um, right, this inner voice never ceases to exhort him to such a transformation, just as he first finds peace within his own inner realm through a real and decisive turnaround. And as if only now the initial idea had been satisfied, finds himself reconciled with his guardian spirit. So, this is why when we are in the light, acting according to the good, we feel this peace. And why, when we are acting badly, we feel guilt. It is um, this consciousness of both possibilities comes with uh, feelings, right? Um, and there's a positive feeling when I do good, which comes from my uh, pushing myself toward further unity and order and understanding, and guilt when I do bad. Even though I can't prevent myself from doing bad, I still feel guilt about it. Uh, and even though, like Cato, I may just be a good person by nature, I still feel good about being good. So reconcile with his guardian spirit. It is true in the strictest sense, so in the strictest understanding, that given how man is in fact created, it is not he himself, but rather the good or evil spirit in him that acts. And nonetheless, this does no harm to freedom. For precisely the allowing to act within himself of the good and evil principles is the result of an intelligible act whereby his being and life are determined. Right? It is that um, that I that spirit flows through me. Right? That I have freedom in the first place. Uh, so that it is uh, the will of the ground or the will of God that I am drawn to. It is the allowing of one or the other will to act that is my freedom. It is that is the nature of spirit, and spirit is the possibility of freedom and good and evil. Um, okay. Uh, Now, let's touch on this idea of the historical God a little bit more. On page 58, God has been considered thus far as a self revealing being. But how then does he relate to this revelation as a moral being? Is revelation an action that ensues with blind and unconscious necessity, or is it a free and conscious act? In other words, uh, does God determine how he reveals himself to himself, or is that revelation uh, deterministic? Right? And if it's the latter, a free and conscious act, how does God as a moral being relate to evil and the possibility and actuality of which depend on the self revelation? And isn't it, if God is a free actor who chooses how to unfold himself, doesn't this make him responsible for evil? And again, I think we've touched on this, right? Evil is there in order for God to demonstrate uh, the overpowering goodness of love. If God were for us a merely logical abstraction, then everything would have to proceed from him with logical necessity. He himself would be, as it were, only the highest law from which all things flow out, but without personhood and consciousness of personhood. And so this is the Kantian God, the Spinozist God, the Leibnizian God to some extent. But we have explained God as a living unity of forces. And if personality is founded, according to our previous explanation, on a connection between a self determining being and a basis independent of him, then similarly, because both of these completely saturate the other and are but one being, God is the highest personality through the connection of the ideal principle in him with the independent ground. Right? God is spirit in the eminent and absolute understanding. It is so certain that the personality in him is grounded only through the bond of God with nature that by contrast the God of pure idealism, as well as of pure realism, is necessarily an impersonal being. And so, again, arguing for God as a personality, as something that chooses and chooses to be in such a way. Uh, But because in God there's an independent ground of reality and hence two equally eternal beginnings of self revelation, God must also be considered in regard to his freedom in relation to both. The first beginning for the creation is the yearning of the one to give birth to itself, or the will of the ground. The second is the will of love, whereby the word is spoken out into nature and through which God first makes himself personal. That is why the will of the ground cannot be free in the sense in which the will of love is, right? Because uh, the will of the ground, which is the possibility of evil, is ultimately uh, dependent on and and given over solely for the purpose of love. Uh, right? It is only um, love that is genuinely free. And God's true freedom is in the overcoming of evil with love, which will also be the ultimate goal of humanity. Um, so uh, there is the inevitability of evil in God's plan. But for Schelling, that evil isn't properly evil from the perspective of God. It is just as the ground is a means for God to come into existence, the spiritual evil that exists is a ground for spiritual love to come into existence. Uh, and this is a kind of interesting and beautiful passage, I think, on the bottom of 62. He says, even God's existence could not be personal without personal, without such a condition, except that he has this condition within and not without himself. He cannot abolish the condition because he would otherwise have to abolish himself. And he could not abolish the condition of evil. He can come to terms with the condition only through love and subordinate it to himself for his glorification. And so, evil is the ground of love, and it is necessary um, in order for God to be good. Uh, there would also be a ground of darkness in God if he had not made the condition into his own, bound himself to it as one and for the sake of absolute personality. Man never gains control over the condition, although in evil he strives to do so, right? Man's embrace of evil is his attempt to gain control over his own conditions, uh, right? To some extent, right? The evil of world domination is man's attempt to um, bind his will to the will of the ground and again replace God. Uh, it is only lent to him and is independent from him. Hence, his personality and selfhood can never rise to full actuality. Uh, Now, here's the line that I think is nice. This is the sadness that clings to all finite life. And even if there is in God at least a relatively independent condition, there is a source of sadness in him that can, however, never come into actuality, but rather serves only the eternal joy of overcoming. God might view evil as evil, uh, might rather be sad about the existence of evil, but because God has complete understanding of the ground, uh, evil for God is, in fact, uh, the eternal joy of overcoming. Right? Hence, the veil of dejection that is spread over all nature, the deep, indestructible melancholy of all life. Joy must have suffering, suffering must be transfigured in joy. All right. Now, I need to wrap this up, but I want to touch on one last point. But before I do, there's a nice summation of this, right? This idea that for God and for us as we expand our understanding, evil is the opportunity for love to overcome. He writes on 64, the soul of all hate is love, and in the most violent wrath, only the stillness of the most inner centrum, attacked and excited, shows itself. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Um, to go back to this fundamental problem of the relation of grounds to God. Right? How is it that God lays the ground for his own existence? What is the being of God that is beyond mere existence? On 68, he writes, even the spirit is not yet the highest thing, right? Uh, it is but spirit or breath of love, right? Yet love is the highest. It is what existed then before the ground and before that which exists, but not yet as love. Rather, how should we describe it? So, spirit is not the highest. Love is the highest. Love is the object of spirit, the telos of spirit. And love is what existed before the ground and before that which exists. Right? Love is prior to both the ground of God and the existence of God. He writes, here we finally reach the highest point of the entire investigation. What end should serve this primary distinction between being insofar as it is a ground and insofar as it exists? What end? What is the purpose of this distinction between ground and existence? There is either no common point of contact for both, in which case we must declare ourselves in favor of absolute dualism, or there is such a point. Thus, both coincide once again in the final analysis. We must declare ourselves in favor of absolute dualism. Uh, sorry. We have then one being for all oppositions and all identity of light and darkness, good and evil, and for all the inconsistent results to which any rational system falls prey, and which have long been manifest in this system too. So, what is this love that precedes all? This ultimate centrum that unites all things in their independence and allows them to be independent. I think we can hear Kant in the background here, if you know your Kantian ethics. We've already explained what we assume in the first respect, that there must be a being before all ground and before all that exists, thus generally before any duality. How can we call it anything other than the original ground or the non-ground? All right, so love is this non-ground. Love is groundless. Love is unconditional. Love is without limit. Love is prior to existence. Love is, again, what brings God and ground together and what separates them. So this non-ground is what is prior. And what does he mean by non-ground? Isn't this just nothingness? Does love then just become nothingness? He'll go on to say that this is a kind of indeterminateness. So he says on page 70, 69 going on to 70, the being of the ground as of that which exists can only be that which comes before all ground. Thus the absolute, considered merely in itself, the non-ground. Right? The being of the ground as of that which exists, the being of the ground, the being of existence, can only be that which comes before all ground. Being is groundless. There is no ground to being itself. And this is the non-ground, right? But as proved, it cannot be this in any other way than insofar as it divides into two equally eternal beginnings. Not that it can be both at once, but that it is in each in the same way. Thus in each the whole, or in its own being. Love, this non-ground, is what gives independence to both ground and God. And it's that independence, the autonomy of each, which is the centrum, is the unity, what unites them. How are ground and God alike? They are both autonomous, and that autonomy is groundless, is love. Uh, I'm not sure this solves all the problems that Schelling might hope it does. I don't think he thinks it does. He's describing the problem. But the non-ground divides itself into the two exactly equal beginnings, so that the two, which could not exist simultaneously or be one in it as the non-ground, become one through love. That is, it divides itself only so that there may be life and love and personal existence. Right? This non-ground, this right, primordial love uh, gives division so that that division can be unified. For love is neither in indifference nor where opposites are linked, which require linkage, but rather this is the secret of love, that it links such things of which each could exist for itself, yet does not and cannot exist without the other. Uh, it is this non ground, it is love that makes all these independent beings, which could exist independently and are autonomous, uh, all hang together. It makes them part of a whole. Right? For this reason, as duality comes to be in the non-ground, love comes to be as well, linking that which exists with the ground for existence. But the ground remains free and independent from the world until the final total separation. Thus, then, it dissolves itself, as the initial yearning does in man when he crosses over to clarity, and as an enduring being grounds himself, in that everything true and good in this yearning is raised into bright consciousness. Right? So the understanding will conquer the anarchy of the ground in this unity of love. It says, and we'll conclude with this: above spirit is the initial non-ground. There is no longer indifference, neutrality, and not yet the identity of both principles, but rather a general unity that is the same for all, and yet gripped by nothing, that is free from all, and yet a beneficence acting in all. In a word, love, which is all in all. Uh, so we're going to end it there for today. But I think I'll try and do one more video wrapping up, and I'll try and reflect on how this Schelling material relates to the other metaphysicians that we've read over the course of the semester. But that'll do it for our reading of Schelling's Freedom Essay. All right.